Time Ghost Army Brigadier Stephen Przybylski dedicates this episode to all the refugees and displaced persons of this war, in particular his mother Maria Przybylska. More on that later. August 3rd, 1945. Your enemies have defeated your forces on land, at sea, and in the skies, and they have demanded your unconditional surrender. But what happens if you neither announce that you accept or reject the ultimatum? What happens if your answer is silence? I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, what's left of the Japanese Navy was mostly destroyed. There was fighting in China as the Chinese tried to retake Guilin, and the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. I read the whole declaration last week, actually. Japanese Prime Minister Kentaro Kangaroo Suzuki holds a press conference on the 28th as this week begins. Now, Domei, the Japanese government's official news service, reported the 27th, if you'll remember, that the government was going to ignore the Allied demand for unconditional surrender and continue fighting to the end. Is that the case? Well, it sort of is. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo has been instrumental in this making no official comment. His idea was to remain silent, perhaps noting that since there had been a change between the Cairo and Potsdam declarations, other more substantial changes might follow. Unfortunately, Premier Suzuki was influenced by the opposition of the military and announced that the Japanese reaction was that of Mokusatsu. Now, the third revised edition of Kenkushia's new Japanese-English dictionary gives Mokusatsu's meanings as take no notice of, ignore, treat with silent contempt, and remain in a wise and masterly inactivity. There has been much made of an alleged mistranslation of this term here, particularly by lecturer and scholar Kazuo Kawai, that a correct translation received by the Allies of withhold comment rather than ignore would have placated the Allies, and that this was different from rejection. But in Boris Nemushin's rather brilliantly logical words, ignore, take no notice of, and withhold comment send absolutely the same message in this context. It does not matter whether you withhold comment, remain in a wise and masterly inactivity, or take no notice of the ultimatum warning you that any other answer except unconditional surrender would cause prompt and utter destruction. In other words, if you do not accept it, you reject it. And that is exactly what this statement did. No translator can be blamed for making this most tragic translation mistake in history because there was no translation mistake. So, at the press conference, when asked, what is the Premier's view regarding the joint proclamation by the three countries, this is what Suzuki has to say. I believe the joint proclamation by the three countries is nothing but a rehash of the Cairo Declaration. As for the government, it does not find any important value in it, and there is no other recourse but to ignore it entirely and resolutely fight for the successful conclusion of this war. That's pretty clear. But you know it makes sense. Without any word whatsoever as to the fate of the emperor in the declaration, both hawk and dove alike don't feel they can answer the unconditional surrender demand. But whatever else Suzuki says, fight on means fight on. So what are the reactions, both in Japan and abroad? Well, in Japan, military opposition, even among the more moderate generals, increases. Domei on August 1st calls the declaration a one-man show put on by America. Togo does manage to get the newspapers to not explain Mokusatsu as rejecting by ignoring, but importantly, the Japanese newspapers are not allowed to print certain parts of the declaration, like Clause 9. The Japanese military forces, after being completely disarmed, shall be permitted to return to their homes with the opportunity to lead peaceful and productive lives. Nope, not allowed to print that. Or this from Clause 10. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation. Those are just not printed. But there are, however, Western sources quoted that sort of imply that the idea of unconditional surrender is not popular with everyone. Daniel Wiklund, Sweden's London correspondent for the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter, is quoted as saying, London is earnestly discussing the problem whether the unconditional terms for Japan can be mildened so that Japanese face can be kept and the Allies will not suffer from enormous losses in the future. In the States, U.S. government personnel are pretty outspoken about things. Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew calls it unfortunate, if not utterly stupid, for example, which is kind of the general consensus. The New York Times headline, the 30th, reads, Japan officially turns down Allied surrender terms ultimatum. And U.S. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal comments that the Japanese cabinet is determined that the war be fought with all the vigor and bitterness of which the nation is capable, so long as the only alternative is unconditional surrender. The thing is, without a Japanese surrender, then the order U.S. President Harry Truman gave Carl Spaatz, the commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces, last week, to deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about the 3rd of August 1945 on one of the targets, Hiroshima, Nagata, and Nagasaki, is in effect. So if the weather clears in the next few days, then, as John Keegan puts it, the attempt to bring the Second World War to an end by the use of a revolutionary superweapon had been decided. Spaatz flew from Europe to D.C. to take command of strategic air forces for the coming invasion of Japan. On the 25th, he began a 4-day journey from there to Guam, carrying the presidential order with him. Those 3 Japanese cities I mentioned, by the way, were chosen since they've not been firebombed and heavily damaged so far, so that an atomic explosion will be more spectacular over any of them. Also the 25th, the American heavy cruiser Indianapolis set out from Tinian, after crossing the Pacific to stop there to deliver the lead buckets containing uranium-235 and the case for the little boy atomic bomb. Butler McVeigh, Indianapolis captain, knows he was carrying something pretty important, though not exactly what, since his orders read, if she goes down, save the cargo at all costs, in a lifeboat if necessary, and every day you save on your voyage will cut the length of the war by just as much. Well, he completed his mission, which must have been a relief, and then set out for Leyte. He never reaches it. On July 30th, American heavy cruiser Indianapolis is sunk by a Japanese submarine at midnight midnight in the Philippine Sea after delivering atomic bomb materials to Tinian. Torpedoes explode under the fuel tanks and tear the ship in half. It sinks in 12 minutes. The crew is unable to send a distress signal before the ship goes down. There are like 1,195 men on the ship, and 300 go down with it. Of the 890 men set adrift on the open sea, well, most of them set adrift since there are a few lifeboats and life jackets, but just 316 survive. See, Naval Command doesn't even know of the sinking until a few days later when survivors are spotted in the open ocean. Many are injured, all suffer from the effects of hunger, exposure, and dehydration, and just to make things worse, dozens of sharks have been attracted to the wreck, and they make quick work of the dead and bleeding, but also begin to attack the others, and anywhere from a few dozen to 150 or so men die from shark attacks. But overall, this is the greatest loss of life at sea from a single ship in U.S. naval history. Oddly enough, though the ship itself sends out no signal after being hit, the Japanese submarine commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, radios Tokyo that he has sunk a New Mexico-class battleship, Idaho, and gives the latitude and longitude. The Americans intercept and decode this already on the 30th and send it to naval headquarters on Guam. But as Japanese claims of sinking were almost always absurdly exaggerated, no one thought to ascertain what ship it might be or to check the area by air search. Had that been done, rescue efforts might have been started a full 3 days before they were in fact begun. Well, Spaatz arrives at Guam the 29th and briefs Curtis LeMay, who runs strategic bombing over Japan, and Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, who are to drop the first atomic bombs, about the orders to drop the bomb currently being assembled. General Grove's schedule called for 2 nuclear weapons to be ready for dropping at the beginning of August, and 2 more plutonium bombs to be assembled for use 2 weeks later. That very day, Tibbet's crews had completed the final phase of the training by dropping 10,000-pound orange-painted blockbuster bombs on Japanese targets. Groves directed the Manhattan Project, which developed the bombs. On the 30th, Spots tells Washington that according to POW reports, Hiroshima is the only one of the proposed targets that does not have any Allied POW camps. Washington says that if he thinks this information reliable, then Hiroshima should have priority over the other targets. This week, actually, the conventional bombing of Japan is reaching new levels, and the largest raid of the entire war so far comes August 1st. The results on the ground went far beyond anything that had been done in Europe or indeed anywhere else in the history of warfare. In the heart of the major cities, one could gaze to the horizon in any direction and see nothing but fields of ash and hillocks of rubble. At the height of the bombing campaign between May and August 1945, a monthly average of 34,402 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs were dropped on Japan. Toll goes on to explain that, according to USAAF Chief Hap Arnold, that monthly total is planned to reach 100,000 tons in September and then increase each month until January. It'll be 170,000 tons, which is more than the entire total dropped on Japan so far for the whole war. By March 1946, it should be over 200,000 tons. By now, though, the bombers are calling their shots, meaning that they drop tens of thousands of leaflets over cities, warning people to evacuate because they're coming back, and then they come back a couple days later and pound that city, making good the warnings each time, and showing the local populace the total helplessness of the Japanese air forces and military in general. The warnings are suppressed and all, but word spreads by mouth, and refugees clog the roads from the leafleted cities, since basically the entire population tries to leave, and their absence shuts down the local munitions factories and the like. So it is pretty effective. Many of the locals also appreciate the warnings to not stay around and get bombed, since they're not getting warned by their own government. At least in Burma, some Japanese are trying to help others. After Japanese 28th Army's bloody failure trying to get its remnants across the Sitang River back on the 21st, Japanese 15th Army now steps in on July 28th to try and help whatever survivors they can. They are forced to retire already the next day, however, having rescued a fair number of their comrades, but seeing what a disaster the whole breakout attempt had been. Of the 18,000 or so men Japanese 28th Army had 10 days earlier, fewer than 6,000 even reached the east bank of the Sitang. Since the British Army began the reconquest of Burma last year, over 100,000 Japanese have been killed in action there. Many thousands more have died of disease, wounds, or starvation in the jungles. In China, the Chinese fully retake Guilin the 29th after entering it last week. They have total control over the road, rail, and communications between Guangxi and Hunan. Also, Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki is receiving reports from the Kwangtung Army in the north of China about Soviet troops and tanks massing across the Manchurian border, which might indicate an impending attack. But he doesn't really react to these much. On top of that, the operations section of that army concludes that no Soviet attack there is possible until at least mid-September, and not likely until 1946. As we know, and have since the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin has promised the Western Allies to join the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. And that 3 months is almost up. There is another conference coming to its end this week, the one in Potsdam. It ends August 2nd, and the Potsdam Agreement is published. This is written by the US, Britain, and the USSR, and has to do with Germany and its reconstruction, occupation, its borders, demilitarization, reparations, and the prosecution of war criminals, that sort of stuff. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from other parts of Europe, too. Now, the French are part of the occupation of Germany, but they were not invited to the conference, so they, well, specifically Charles de Gaulle, are not too keen on implementing it in their zone of occupation. Like, they refuse to resettle any Germans from Eastern Europe in their zone. And they're against proposals to establish common policies across the zones of occupation. As we saw last week, Poland gets a big chunk of Germany's former territory, Pomerania and Silesia, and splits East Prussia with the Soviets. But the former eastern Polish border is pushed westward as well. So the Soviets now have Vilna and Lvov, and while several million Germans have been or are currently heading west from the new Poland to Germany, millions of Poles are heading west from the new Soviet Union to Poland. So a bunch of cities in the former eastern parts of Germany acquire new Polish names. Stettin becomes Szczecin, Breslau, Wrocław, Kolberg, Kolobrzeg, Allenstein, Olsson, Rastenburg, Kętrzyn. Here's a rather long quote from Martin Gilbert's The Second World War about the post-war European settlement. At the end of the First World War, when instead of unconditional surrender, the Germans and their allies had been allowed to accept an armistice, the terms of peace had been negotiated. The victors had nevertheless imposed their wishes on the defeated states. Territory was taken away, reparations were secured, and armies disbanded in the guise of a negotiated peace. This peace had soon been denounced as a dictated one, and political agitators, among them Hitler, had stirred up intense nationalism through these denunciations. The Allies were determined not to allow that situation to recur, hence their insistence on unconditional surrender. The boundaries and conditions created in the post-war world would be subject neither to negotiation nor discussion with those who had been defeated. By this method, the Allies intended that Potsdam would not repeat what had been seen as the errors and weaknesses of Versailles. The Germans would not be able to feel that their leaders had let them down at the negotiating table. The negotiations at Potsdam had been conducted without any German representation. There I will end the week. A week that sees some fighting in China and Burma, but sees more planning than anything with the Potsdam Agreement. The Soviet troops massing, the atomic bombs being ready to drop, and the Japanese government simply not replying to the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. On July 30th, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wires the president at Potsdam for final approval of dropping the bombs, the targets, and the wording of the announcement they will release after dropping them. President Truman sends his answers, saying they should absolutely not be dropped before the 2nd. That is the day he goes to Plymouth, England, to have lunch with King George VI, and then boards the heavy cruiser Augusta home. Well, this week ends today the 3rd, without atomic bombs being dropped. I'm pretty sure that such bombs will be dropped on Japanese cities next week. You will not want to miss that. As I mentioned at the beginning, Time Ghost Army Brigadier Stephen Przybylski dedicates this episode to the millions of refugees and displaced persons of this war, among them his mother, Maria Przybylska. Like so many other refugees, her story is one of tragedy and terror, but also of survival through hard work, random acts of kindness, and sometimes pure luck. Maria was born in Warsaw in 1923. We actually told the first part of her story during a memorial for her mother, Helena. That's our Brigadier Stephen's grandmother, back in one of our October 1944 episodes. In that memorial, we covered how Maria, then aged 16, her brother Andrzej, then 14, and their father Władysław escaped Poland on September 17, 1939, just hours before the Red Army closed the border. Though they had made it out of Poland, their difficulties were only beginning. They were shot at in Romania and robbed of nearly everything they had in Yugoslavia. Traveling by train through neutral Italy, they managed to reach Paris in October, where Maria and Andrzej entered a high school for refugees. Maria completed her final exams June 8, 1940, just a few days before the Germans took Paris. Because her father was a Polish Army Reserve officer, the family had to flee once again. They raced south to Bordeaux, but were unable to get on the last British evacuation ships. Their hopes then turned to Maria's uncle, living in Brooklyn, but despite having sponsorship papers, the U.S. consulate told them, The Polish quota was full. Staying in Vichy France was not an option. With ingenuity and perseverance, they made their way through Spain with Moroccan visas and Portugal with Argentinian visas. They were finally able to board a freighter from Lisbon to Britain and arrived penniless in September 1940, just as the Blitz began hitting London. Maria went up to Scotland to study physics at the University of Glasgow. She received her doctorate in 1949 and shortly afterwards emigrated to Canada. She spent over 40 years at the National Research Council of Canada and published over 70 papers in the field of X-ray crystallography. Together, Maria and her husband Václav raised 2 boys, Martin and our Brigadier Stephen. She passed away peacefully in 2008. If you would like to memorialize an episode of this series, you can do so by joining the Time Ghost Army at Brigadier level for 1 year or by making a one-time donation. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.